I began recording this video to document disassembling my carburetor. However, when I went back to look at the hour and 42 minutes of footage I took, not a single bit of it had sound. So the microphone must have been loose or something. So I'm going to voice over this and hope that I can guess what I'm talking about. Alright, so what I have is a 1980 Honda Civic Wagon with a bad carburetor, and I'm going to be rebuilding a previously remanufactured carburetor which was in service for about 15 years, and it went kaput a few months ago, and I replaced it with the stock carburetor, and that lasted about 2 weeks, and it went kaput. So I'm going to rebuild this carburetor again and hope that it works. It's not an exact replacement. There's a few minor differences. This may be like an 81 or 82 carburetor, I'm not sure, but it worked for 15 years, so it's close enough, right? Here I'm pointing to one of the cutoff solenoids, the other one. So this little one cuts off part of the air system, I think, or part of the vacuum system rather. Has a little O-ring on it there. And the wire is pinched in that little tab there. So it's a single positive wire feeds both. And whenever the car is on, both those solenoids are open. And whenever the car is off, both those solenoids close. And this prevents fuel from flooding down into the engine, which shouldn't happen anyway, but these are just safety features. Some carburetors actually have a third solenoid on there for the auxiliary, but my carburetors don't have that. Would be a nice feature, but I have 3 carburetors currently, and none of them have the second one. So that you can see there's a little rubber plunger. That actually shuts off the fuel directly. The other one shuts off the vacuum system. And there's an O-ring there. I try to be careful when I take these things off, because I'm never sure if I can replace them. You just never know. So if I can keep everything intact. I'm also noticing there's a whole bunch of white crud built up inside the bowl there. Okay, it looks like I'm going to be taking off the idle speed control diaphragm. Let me look that up here. I have a cheat sheet here. This is one advantage of voiceover, is I'm looking at reference pictures here, if I can find it. Throttle opener assembly, that's what it is. And I'm looking at taking that whole bracket off first. And sometimes it's better to loosen them up, especially that one. That one's on really tight there. But yeah, sometimes it's better to loosen these things up with the ratchet so you don't round off the Phillips head. Some of them you just can't get to. Except for a screwdriver, but it's so ironic. I thought the washing machine and the furnace were going to interfere with the sound quality of the video. So, but not so much. So that bracket normally holds the throttle opener assembly and the AC idle adjust diaphragm. This carburetor doesn't have the idle adjust or the AC adjust because the AC on my car doesn't work, so it doesn't need it. I'm removing a blocked off vacuum port, one of 3 that don't correspond to anything on my car that this particular carburetor has, and I'm trying to get it off without ruining it. There it is. Okay, so this guy that I'm about to take off is the float bowl vent shutoff assembly. And that has to do with collecting fumes from the float bowls in the gas tank and into the charcoal canister when the car is off, and pulling them into the air intake when the car is running, which is vacuum controlled, and there's a little plunger that opens and shuts the port to the air cleaner assembly. So set that aside. Oh, looks like I'm going to take that off next. Okay, that is the choke opener assembly. So apart from the electric choke, there are a couple of diaphragms, vacuum diaphragms, that help control the choke mechanism. This is one of them. Again, gotta be careful not to round off the heads on these screws, or you're going to be in trouble. But you got to remember, most of this carburetor is aluminum with a little bit of brass. It does not like torque. So let the O-rings and the seals and the gaskets do the work. And there it comes off. Choke opener assembly. And there's an O-ring in there to keep track of too. So most of these mechanisms can be tested by putting your thumb over one of the holes and seeing if the vacuum diaphragm holds a vacuum. So sure enough, it does. Okay, I'm pulling a cotter pin out of something. Oh, okay. I'm pulling the connecting rod off of the actual butterfly valve for the choke. and another cotter pin comes off to disconnect something else. I believe there's a lower linkage that has to be disconnected in order to get the electric choke assembly off, and I think that's what I just did. So now it looks like I'm taking the choke assembly off, the electric choke assembly. Yep, held on by 2 screws. There it is. Okay. So with the choke housing loose, that lower linkage can be disconnected. There we go. And there's the whole electric choke assembly. So these carburetors have this little tiny fuel pump, and it's not to be confused with the electric fuel pump that feeds fuel to the carb. This is a little tiny fuel pump that feeds a little tiny bit of extra fuel into the main jet when there's a sudden demand on the engine, like if you press the accelerator cable really hard all of a sudden. Without this little pump, the engine would stumble briefly. This little pump compensates for that. If you hit the gas slowly, then the pump doesn't really do much, and it doesn't need to. So there's the lever. And they put part of the assembly over where the dust jacket should go, but there's no dust jacket, so there should be like a little rubber boot right there. Okay, I think I'm actually going for the top of the carburetor body. Yep. This part that I'm going to remove, this top piece, is sometimes referred to as the air horn. I believe it has 10 screws holding it on, 3 of which are inside, like in the middle of the top. Yeah, there's one. And then the rest are around the outside, but 3 are in the middle. And they are all the same size and length, so that's nice. You don't have to worry about putting them in the right order or anything like that. And this is on with a gasket, so it's a little stuck. There it went. And there's my first look inside, where the issue is most likely to be, is somewhere in there. But honestly, I don't think I ever really did find any particular thing wrong with it. There's the last three screws. So I'm noticing that this auxiliary float bowl is way up high, and I think that is a result of my mechanic trying to adjust the carburetor after it started malfunctioning. But that is definitely way out of adjustment. Okay, I'm very carefully removing the old gasket. If I can remove it intact, I may be able to reuse it. So this gasket might be 15 years old. But I'm not sure. This carburetor may have been worked on sometime during the 15 years it was on my car. There it is, intact. So I may be able to reuse that. Let's not mix it up. Alright. Now, at some point I discover that one of those little channel caps is missing. There's three. Oh, yep, there's one, there's two, and there's where the third one should be, but it isn't. So I'm going to have to find that. Not sure when it went missing, but it's definitely gone missing. And if I had thought about it, a piece of Scotch tape will pull those little plastic channel covers right out without you having to pry them out or anything like that. You can also turn the thing upside down and hope they don't fall away, like off the table. And sometimes they just come right out with a pick, which is what happened in this case. So you can't mix them up. They're three different sizes. Oh, two of my vacuum system ports on the back of the carburetor are plugged off, capped off, because I don't have corresponding hoses to connect it to on my car. So I'll just remove those rubber caps. I seem to be taking a very long time to point out which ones they are. I have no idea. Oh yeah, between those two ports is a plug that looks like a screw, like it'd be an adjustment screw, but it's not. The adjustment screw is actually hidden way down inside that hole that I just pointed to. Okay, it looks like that assembly is next. Okay, this is the secondary opener diaphragm assembly. This is a vacuum controlled guy that pulls open on the secondary throttle body butterfly valve. So it opens up as you push the gas pedal more than halfway or so. It's got one little O-ring in there connecting it to a vacuum system. So, and it appears to work. Okay, right there is the lambda linkage. So, I'm explaining here, do not adjust that ever. It synchronizes that auxiliary barrel with the primary barrel. And they have to be synchronized just so, or the engine just won't run right. And there's nothing on there that needs to ever be adjusted. So it's always best just to leave it alone. Okay, here I'm removing the idle adjustment screw. And that's a very simple guy. It's just a screw and a spring and a plastic knob, and it allows you to adjust your idle speed by hand, which is always best to do when the engine is warm. Okay, here we're disconnecting the lambda linkage connection between the throttle body and the main body. This is necessary in order to separate the two. Held on by 5 large screws on the bottom. So in between the throttle body and the main body there's a plastic spacer. There is the spacer. So there are 2 big funny shaped seals, and there should be 3 alignment pins. 2 small ones and a large one. The large one in this case is missing. Oh, that spacer is made out of some kind of plastic. And there's that weird shaped seal. So here I'm looking at the little built-in throttle body for the auxiliary barrel, and I'm also on a journey of discovery where I'm about to find out that my screwdriver is too small and I'm going to have to go get a bigger one. So it looks like okay, so this is the power valve. I believe this assembly operates in conjunction with the fuel pump. I think the fuel pump operates the power valve to throw that little bit of extra. Yeah, there's the fuel pump lever. Yeah, throws that little bit of extra fuel into the primary jet so that when you mash on the accelerator the engine won't stumble. And I believe that is spring-loaded. I mean, yep. I mean a little, not a lot, just a little. So best to remove things carefully, and that's full of crud, which is always fun. And there's a sort of a top hat diaphragm there. The reason it's shaped weird is because that metal piece in the middle is a little tiny fuel reservoir for the valve. When the valve opens, it pulls the fuel out of that. And those things can really stick to the aluminum, but if you remove it carefully and don't tear it, you can reuse those things. Some of these parts come in rebuild kits and some don't, so it's always best to be real careful. Oh, and here I'm discovering the power valve is completely stuck shut. But yeah, that little pin is a little spring-loaded pin. It should move up and down freely, and it doesn't, so that's going to have to be addressed later. And there's an O-ring that seals it up. So here's the underneath of the fuel pump. Again, this is not the fuel pump that pumps gas from the tank to the carburetor. This is the fuel pump that pumps that tiny little bit of gasoline to the primary, also spring-loaded. And here you can see the two O-rings actually came out with the cover instead of sitting in their slots like they normally do. And that little steel ball in there is not supposed to move. That's a plug. The steel ball that actually moves is way inside there, and you can hear it if you shake it, if it's moving freely. And this diaphragm is also really stuck to the aluminum. And there it is. So that may be reusable. So that's those two done. Next is the throttle cable bracket. Behind the throttle cable bracket is the adjustment screw for the auxiliary fuel-air mixture. A 2-barrel carburetor will not have one of these, but since this is a 3-barrel carburetor, it has one. On models after 1980, the adjustment screw is actually not adjustable. Instead of a threaded needle that fits down inside the body, it's actually more like a screw that acts as a plug. And I believe the length of that plug is set at the factory. But in any case, the secondary air-fuel screw is not adjustable on this particular model, which is good because it's very tricky to adjust these outside the factory. Again, there's a plug that looks like an adjustment screw, but all it is a plug. It does nothing else. So best not to mess with it. Okay, we are taking off the auxiliary jet. This is a long tube with threads on one end. And I believe this one is differentiated by having a little notch cut into it along the length of the tube towards the bottom there. So this upper fellow that I'm removing now is the primary jet. The primary does not have a notch, and I believe the bottom tip of it has a distinct copper color, whereas the auxiliary jet has a notch, but the tip is brass colored, same as the rest of the jet. So now we've got primary and secondary air bleeds. So incidentally, from left to right, there's the primary barrel, the secondary barrel, and the auxiliary barrel. The primary and secondary operate just like a two-barrel carburetor, and then that third barrel, called the auxiliary barrel, is the one that feeds the little pre-fire chamber in the CVCC engine. So there comes the secondary air bleed. Now under the secondary air bleed is an emulsion tube. So let's get that emulsion tube out if we can. There it is. So that's got little tiny pinholes in the side, and those all need to be clear. There should also be 2 alignment pins between the main body and the air horn, and this particular unit is missing both of those alignment pins. Okay, so we've got our extremely large screwdriver, which will finally unplug that plug. And that's all we needed it for. So the plug has an O-ring as well. Now I'm just looking over one more time to make sure there aren't any plastic or rubber bits left that need to be taken off. That is done as far as the main body of the carburetor. So let's revisit the throttle body real quick. Now there's a couple little plastic pieces on the linkage that you got to be careful with. They don't really, it's a real pain to get that linkage apart. There's one and there's one. And personally, I just as soon leave those be, because they're on the outside of the carburetor, so it doesn't really matter if they're dirty. And I don't know what the tension on those springs is supposed to be, so if I unwind them, I don't know if I'll be able to rewind them properly, and it just, yeah. So I just leave those 2 pieces on, and I just take that into account when I'm soaking it in various cleaners. I just remember there's a couple little plastic pieces still on there. And the one thing we still have to take off is the primary air fuel adjustment screw. So sometimes there is a anti-tamper cap on there that you got to pry out. In this case, it's long gone. So before you take the screw out, it's customary to determine what position it's in. So what I'm doing is I'm marking a little notch where the head of the screw is located, and I'm going to call that, you know, sort of like 12 o'clock, and or the top of the circle, and then I'm going to screw it all the way in, and I'm going to count how many rotations it takes before it's fully seated and can't go in anymore. And actually, in this case, the number of screws really, or turns, really surprised me. It was something like 4 3/4. It seems to me that is a lot more than it would normally be. Here I am double checking. Is it really that far? Yes, it is. So let's write it down. Something like 4 3/4. I don't think you can see it on the camera, but at that point you could just screw the whole thing right out. So when we go to put the screw back in, we will screw it down all the way till it's seated, and then we'll back it out 4 3/4 rotation. And that should leave it adjusted exactly the same as when we took it off. Whether that's the proper position or not, that will have to be determined later when the carb is back on the car. But it's a starting point, right? Okay, so the primary adjustment needle comes with a spring, a washer, and a tiny little O-ring that's really hard to get out. Okay, so there's the spring, which shouldn't have been that hard to get out. That's usually pretty loose inside there. Okay, here's a straight pick, and that will let me reach all the way down to the valve seat. Hopefully I can get that O-ring out of there. So that's it for the throttle body. That is ready to be cleaned. The main body is ready to be cleaned. Now we just have the air horn to disassemble. So this particular carburetor has 2 valve seats, the primary valve seat and the auxiliary valve seat. The primary, of course, is for the main float bowl that feeds the normal parts of the 2-barrel carburetor, and then the auxiliary valve seat feeds the second float bowl that exists solely to feed that little auxiliary barrel. In hindsight, I should have taken the floats off before messing with this, just to make sure they don't get damaged or anything. But here comes the valve seat. And it's missing its fuel strainer. That's irritating. Should have 2 O-rings and a fuel strainer. It's got the 2 O-rings, no fuel strainer. A fuel strainer might have helped keep it from getting clogged up. And fuel strainers don't come with rebuild kits, so I will have to find a fuel strainer. Okay, I'm finally taking the floats off, which I really should have done before. Pins are in there pretty good. So I'm just going to give it some light taps. Till that pin comes out. And the float, which doesn't sound like it has any fuel in it. And the float needle. And the same thing with the other float. If the pin doesn't come out easy, just give it a little tap. Shouldn't take much. And out it comes. Floats also don't come with rebuild kits, but you can get them on eBay. Sometimes, anyway. You can reuse floats, but make sure they actually float first. I made that mistake once. Put the old floats back on the carb. Carb still didn't work. Took it to the mechanic. Mechanic said, "Oh, your floats sank." Oh. So it's just easy to test them. Just throw them in a bucket of gasoline, and if they float, they're good. If they sink, they're bad. I'm not sure what all I'm talking about here. There should be one more valve seat to remove. There it is, yep. Get that silicone crud out of there so I can unscrew it. So here comes the other valve seat. Now, for some reason that one doesn't quite stick out enough to grab hold of, so usually I just push a pencil in there to pop it up, but in this case I just used a small screwdriver, and again, no fuel strainer. 2 O-rings, but no fuel strainer. So, very disappointing. So, there's one little tiny bushing on the choke butterfly valve that's made of plastic. Apart from that, the air horn is ready for cleaning. And I go ahead and leave that on there anyway. I don't think there's a good way to get it off without breaking it. So I'm just careful what chemicals I use to do cleaning with. A lot of people soak their parts in gasoline, especially the new gasoline with ethanol in it. They leave it soak overnight in just regular old gasoline, and the crud that's left over can typically be sprayed off with a can of carb cleaner spray. Some people use Chem Dip. That would be really bad for the little plastic pieces that I haven't taken off. But that's pretty much the carburetor disassembled at this point. The 3 big pieces can be cleaned up. All the peripheral pieces can be dealt with later. Tested, cleaned up, fixed, whatever. But this is about it for the main body, the air horn, the carburetor body itself, and the throttle assembly. So that is it for this video. I will come back with some future videos when I get more done, and I appreciate you watching. Have a good one.